Over the azure skies of southern Italy on August 15, 1943, Captain Lee Archer of the 99th Fighter Squadron climbed to 22,000 feet in his Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, the Mediterranean sun glinting off wings painted in what his squadron mates called the most audacious camouflage pattern anyone had ever seen. The air at that altitude bit cold through his oxygen mask, and he could see the Italian coastline stretching below like a watercolor painting, browns and greens bleeding into the turquoise sea. Archer believed, as did most of his fellow Tuskegee airmen, that superior flying skill and determination would be their greatest weapons against the experienced German fighter units prowling these same skies. They had no idea that within 6 weeks, the innovation painted onto Archer's aircraft would fundamentally change how the Army Air Forces thought about tactical deception, and that the German pilots they faced would file reports describing phantom aircraft that seemed to materialize from nowhere. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how one pilot's unconventional thinking, born from necessity and refined through combat experience, would transform him from an untested aviator facing discrimination on 2 fronts into the architect of a camouflage technique so effective that intelligence officers initially refused to believe his success rate, and how his innovations would later influence jet fighter design in the Korean conflict and beyond. Lee Archer had arrived in North Africa in April of 1943 with a chip on his shoulder and something to prove. The son of a Harlem physician, he had graduated from New York University before the conflict began, working as a medical student before the call to service redirected his path. His father had wanted him to follow in the family profession, to bring modern medicine to communities that desperately needed it. But when the opportunity to join the Army Air Force's experimental program at Tuskegee came, Lee seized it with both hands, knowing that every flight, every mission would be scrutinized not just for tactical success, but as evidence for or against the capabilities of Negro pilots in combat roles. The journey to that cockpit had been anything but straightforward. The Tuskegee program itself was born from political pressure and military skepticism in equal measure. For decades, the military had maintained that African Americans lacked the intelligence, reflexes, and courage necessary for aviation. Scientific papers had been written, studies conducted, all designed to provide official justification for exclusion. The program at Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama was launched partly to prove these assumptions correct, with the expectation that the experiment would fail and the issue could be settled definitively. Archer had walked into that environment knowing the odds were deliberately stacked against them. The training was harder than for white aviation cadets. The standards were higher. The washout rate was intentionally brutal. Instructors looked for any excuse to eliminate candidates, and every mistake was documented as evidence of inherent inferiority. But Archer and his fellow cadets had turned that adversity into motivation. They studied longer, practiced harder, pushed themselves beyond what was required because they understood they weren't just fighting to become pilots. They were fighting to open doors for everyone who would come after them. He had graduated in the top 15% of his class, earning his wings and silver pilot badge in January 1943. The ceremony had been bittersweet. His mother had traveled from New York to attend, but his father had stayed home, still unable to accept that his son had chosen military service over medicine. In his father's view, healing was the higher calling, and flying machines built for combat was a waste of Lee's intellectual gifts. But standing on that Alabama airfield, wings pinned to his chest, Archer had felt certain he had made the right choice. This was his chance to prove something larger than himself, to demonstrate that excellence had no color, that courage and skill belonged to anyone willing to earn them. The 99th Fighter Squadron, America's first African-American fighter unit, had deployed to the Mediterranean theater, under a cloud of skepticism that followed them across the Atlantic. White commanders questioned their reflexes, their courage, their ability to handle the stress of aerial combat. Every mission report was examined for proof of inferiority, every mistake magnified, every success downplayed or attributed to luck. General Henry Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, had personally expressed doubts about the experiment. Colonel William Momyer, A senior officer in theater had sent reports to Washington suggesting the Negro pilots lacked aggressive spirit and should be relegated to coastal patrol duties. Archer knew the mathematics of prejudice. They couldn't just be good, they had to be exceptional, and even then it might not matter. The burden of representation weighed heavily. When white pilots made mistakes, they were individual failures. When Negro pilots made mistakes, they became evidence of racial inadequacy. It was exhausting, infuriating, and unavoidable. His assigned aircraft, a P-40 Warhawk with the tail number 43789, was already a veteran of North African skies when he inherited it from a pilot who had been rotated stateside. Lieutenant Marcus Williams had flown the plane through the Tunisia campaign, and he handed it over to Archer with mixed feelings. "She's a good bird," Williams had said during the handover, running his hand along the fuselage with genuine affection. "Reliable engine, tight control response, and the guns track true, but Lee, the paint job is going to get you spotted before you spot them. I lost count of how many times I got bounced because Jerry saw me first." The plane bore the scars of combat: patched bullet holes in the tail, a replacement panel on the left wing where German cannon rounds had torn through, and a paint job that Archer found utterly inadequate. Standard Army Air Forces camouflage in the Mediterranean theater consisted of dark earth and olive drab on top, neutral grey on the bottom, a scheme designed for aircraft operating over European terrain, not the brilliant azure of Mediterranean skies. The P-40 Warhawk itself was something of a compromise. Originally designed in the late 1930s, it had been cutting edge before the conflict began, but was now outclassed by newer German fighters in speed and ceiling. What it had was ruggedness, firepower, 650 caliber machine guns mounted in the wings, and when properly maintained, reliability. It couldn't outrun a Messerschmitt Bf 109 or outclimb a Focke-Wulf FW 190, but in the hands of a skilled pilot who understood its strengths, it could hold its own. On his third mission, escorting Douglas A-20 attack aircraft on a strike against railway yards near Naples, Archer learned exactly how inadequate that camouflage was. The mission briefing had been routine: 12 A-20s carrying 500-pound bombs, escorted by 8 P-40s from the 99th. Expected German opposition was moderate. Intelligence suggested most fighter units were being pulled north to defend against increasing bomber raids over mainland Europe. The weather was forecast as clear, visibility unlimited, perfect flying conditions. Archer had been assigned the number 3 position in the escort formation, flying at 18,000 feet, while the A-20s droned toward their target at 12,000. He had been scanning the sky above and behind, knowing from briefings that German Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters preferred to dive from the sun, using altitude advantage and the blinding glare to mask their approach. His wingman, Lieutenant Charles Dryden, flew 200 yards to his right, and below them the A-20s maintained tight formation, their olive drab paint stark against the azure sea. The German fighters came from below. Archer's first indication was tracers arcing past his canopy, bright even against the afternoon sun, followed immediately by the hammer-blow sound of bullets striking metal somewhere behind his cockpit. He slammed the stick left and forward, diving away from the attack line, his heart hammering as he searched for his attacker. The Messerschmitt flashed past, grey-green against the sky, already pulling up for another pass. In that frozen moment, Archer understood. Against the blue Mediterranean sky, his dark painted aircraft stood out like a black stone on snow. The German pilot had spotted them from miles away, positioned himself below where they weren't looking, and attacked with the sky as camouflage. The engagement lasted 4 chaotic minutes. Archer managed to damage one Bf 109, evidenced by smoke trailing from its engine as it broke away, but the Germans had the initiative and used it effectively. They hit 2 of the A-20s, forcing one to abort with a damaged engine before American reinforcements arrived from another squadron, and the Germans broke off. Back at base, during debriefing, Archer couldn't shake the image of that grey-green fighter materializing from the blue void. The intelligence officer conducting the debriefing, a captain named Morrison who had never flown combat, seemed more interested in finding fault than learning from the engagement. "So you were maintaining proper scan discipline?" Morrison asked, his tone suggesting he doubted it. "Yes, sir." I was checking 6 o'clock high and low every 10 seconds like training dictates. But you didn't see them approaching. They came from below, sir. Against the sky, their camouflage worked perfectly. We were dark targets against light background. They were light targets against light background. Morrison made a note. I'll include in my report that scan discipline needs improvement. Archer bit back his frustration. This was how it always went. Negro pilots couldn't be failed by inadequate equipment or doctrine, only by their own supposed inadequacy. He left the debriefing tent angry, but determined. That night, Archer sat in his tent with a notepad, sketching aircraft silhouettes against different backgrounds. He had studied art briefly at NYU, enough to understand color theory, contrast, and how the human eye perceived shapes against varying backgrounds. The problem was obvious. Their aircraft were painted for European operations, designed to hide parked planes from reconnaissance aircraft, not to provide concealment during air-to-air combat against Mediterranean skies. The solution seemed equally obvious, but getting approval to repaint a combat aircraft in unauthorized colors would require navigating a bureaucracy that already viewed the 99th with suspicion. He started small, methodically, using paint scrounged from the maintenance depot, technically intended for touching up identification markings, but available to anyone who knew which sergeant to ask. Archer began experimenting on the undersides of practice targets used on the gunnery range. He mixed lighter shades of blue, testing how different hues appeared at various altitudes and lighting conditions. He created sample panels and had other pilots observe them from different distances and angles, collecting feedback on which combinations blended most effectively with the sky. His tent mate, Lieutenant Clarence Jameson, thought he had lost his mind. Jameson was a practical man from Cleveland, the son of steelworkers, who believed in stick time and gunnery practice, not art projects. "You planning to paint the whole plane baby blue, Lee?" Jameson asked one evening, watching Archer mix pigments by lamplight, the tent smelling of turpentine and linseed oil. "Command will have you flying a desk before you can say court-martial. Hell, they're looking for excuses to ground us anyway. This'll just hand them one." "They want us to fail anyway," Archer replied, not looking up from his work, carefully adding white to lighten a particular shade of azure. "Might as well give them something interesting to write up in the failure report. Besides, I'd rather get grounded for trying something that might work than keep flying in a plane that makes me a sitting duck." "You really think paint is going to make a difference?" "I think Jerry is spotting us before we spot him, and I think our paint job is part of the reason. Change that variable. Maybe we change the outcome." But Archer wasn't planning to paint his aircraft baby blue. What he was developing was far more sophisticated, based on observations he had been collecting since arriving in theater. He had noticed that German aircraft, with their splinter camouflage of grey-green irregular patterns, seemed to blur and fade when viewed against certain backgrounds. The human eye, he reasoned, relied on contrast and hard edges to identify distant objects. If he could disrupt those visual cues, he could buy precious seconds of confusion in combat, seconds that meant the difference between attacker and attacked, between life and death. He had also been studying the way light played across aircraft surfaces at different times of day. Morning light from the east created different shadow patterns than afternoon light from the west. Altitude affected color perception. What looked dark blue at ground level appeared lighter at 20,000 feet, where the air was thinner and light scattered differently. He filled notebook after notebook with observations, diagrams, and calculations. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In late August, a Royal Air Force liaison officer visited the squadron to coordinate joint operations planned for the upcoming invasion of mainland Italy. Flight Lieutenant David Morton had flown Supermarine Spitfires over Malta during the island's desperate defense in 1942, when the tiny Mediterranean island had been subjected to relentless bombing, and the handful of defending fighters had become legendary for their courage and effectiveness. Morton carried with him a portfolio of reconnaissance photographs and tactical assessments, and during a social evening in the officer's tent, he and Archer fell into conversation about the challenges of Mediterranean air combat. One image in particular caught Archer's attention: a German Messerschmitt photographed from above during a reconnaissance mission over Sicily. its camouflage pattern almost invisible against the rocky terrain below. The aircraft seemed to blend into the landscape, its outline obscured by irregular patterns of color that matched the terrain. "Adaptive camouflage?" Morton explained, noticing Archer's intense interest in the photograph. "Jerry's been using it for years, actually quite clever about it. Different patterns for different theaters. What works over the Russian steppes doesn't work over the North Sea, so they adapt. Your chaps are still flying with European paint jobs in Mediterranean skies. Bit like wearing a tuxedo to a cricket match. Stands out, rather." Morton had a dry British wit that Archer appreciated, but beneath the humor was a serious tactical point. The Germans had been thinking about camouflage as an active tactical tool since before the conflict began, while Allied forces still treated it primarily as a way to hide parked aircraft from aerial observation. "How hard is it to get approval for non-standard paint schemes?" Archer asked. Morton laughed. "In the RAF. Depends entirely on your commanding officer and whether you're willing to take initiative first and ask forgiveness later. I knew a Spitfire squadron in North Africa that painted their aircraft pink, absolutely mad-looking on the ground, but brilliant at dawn and dusk when the desert takes on that rose color. Command had fits, but they couldn't argue with the results. Pink Spitfires, now I've heard everything. War makes creative thinkers of us all, old boy. The trick is knowing which rules are actually important and which ones are just bureaucratic habit." Archer studied the photographs late into the night after Morton had retired to his assigned tent. The German aircraft weren't just painted grey-green. They used irregular patterns that broke up the aircraft's outline, making it difficult to judge distance, attitude, or even aircraft type at a glance. But they were still designed primarily for ground camouflage, for hiding parked aircraft from reconnaissance planes. What Archer envisioned was something different, air-to-air camouflage, designed specifically to confuse enemy pilots during the critical seconds of engagement, when human visual perception was everything. His design used 3 base shades of blue: light azure for the undersides, medium blue-gray for the fuselage sides, and darker blue for the upper surfaces, but applied in irregular, flowing patterns rather than the standard hard separation between top and bottom colors. The patterns weren't random. They were calculated to disrupt the eye's ability to determine where one surface ended and another began. He added white highlights along leading edges and random patches of very light blue that would catch sunlight and fragment the aircraft's silhouette. The effect, he calculated, would make it nearly impossible to judge his aircraft's position and heading when viewed against the sky, and would buy him those critical seconds of confusion that could determine the outcome of an engagement. The challenge was getting permission to implement it. Squadron Commander Major George Roberts was sympathetic, but cautious. Roberts was a rarity in the military command structure, a white officer who genuinely believed in the Tuskegee experiment and was determined to see it succeed. He had fought battles with higher command to get his squadron proper equipment and fair treatment, but he also understood the political reality. Any failure by the 99th would be used as ammunition against broader integration efforts. "Lee, I appreciate the initiative," Roberts said when Archer presented his proposal in the squadron command tent, spreading out the sketches and paint samples on a field table. "And intellectually, I think you're onto something. But this isn't like choosing a new tie. That aircraft is government property, and any unauthorized modifications could mean serious consequences. Plus, if it doesn't work, every failure will be blamed on this damn paint job. They'll say it proves Negro pilots don't understand proper military procedure, that we can't be trusted to follow regulations." "And if it does work, sir?" Archer pressed, keeping his voice respectful but firm. "If it actually gives us a tactical advantage, saves lives, helps us complete missions more effectively, isn't that worth the risk? If it works, some staff officer will probably take credit for it," Roberts said with brutal honesty. "That's how the military works. But that's not really what concerns me. What concerns me is giving ammunition to people who want this squadron to fail. Sir, we're getting bounced because they see us first. Every mission brief starts with maintain visual awareness, but we're flying dark aircraft against light skies. It's like asking us to fight with one hand tied behind our backs. I'm not suggesting we violate safety regulations or compromise the aircraft's performance. I'm suggesting we adapt our equipment to our operational environment, which seems like basic tactical sense. Robert studied the paint samples and sketches for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful. He had flown in the Great War, back when aircraft were wood and canvas and tactics were being invented in real time. He understood innovation born of necessity. "I can't officially approve this," he finally said, "but I also can't watch every gallon of paint in the depot. If your aircraft happens to develop some weathering that requires a touch-up, and if that touch-up happens to use some creative color mixing, I might not notice for a few days, clear?" "Crystal clear, sir. And sir, thank you." "Don't thank me yet. If this goes sideways, I can't protect you. I'll do what I can, but there are limits to how far I can stick my neck out, understand?" "Understood, sir." The repaint took 3 nights of intensive work. Archer enlisted Jameson, who had been won over by the logic of the idea, if not entirely convinced it would work, and 2 mechanics from the ground crew who were intrigued by the project. Sergeant Thomas Briggs, a former auto body painter from Detroit who had worked in the custom car industry before being drafted, and Corporal James Wu, who had worked in his family's San Francisco sign painting business before the conflict erupted, and the family had been sent to an internment camp. A fact that gave Wu his own complicated relationship with serving a country that had imprisoned his parents for the crime of having Japanese ancestry. They worked after dark, when most of the squadron was asleep, using drop lights and working lamps to see their work. The maintenance area at night was a strange place, full of shadows and the smell of aviation fuel, the distant sound of guard patrols making their rounds. They had to work quietly, efficiently, knowing that too many questions would shut down the project before it was complete. Briggs proved invaluable, understanding instinctively how to blend the colors so there were no hard lines, only gradual transitions that would confuse the eye. He had painted custom cars for wealthy clients in Detroit, creating effects that made vehicles seem to change color as they moved. That experience translated perfectly to aircraft camouflage. "It's about understanding how light hits curved surfaces," Briggs explained as he worked, his brush moving with practiced precision. "On a car, you want to emphasize the curves, make them dramatic. On a fighter plane, you want to confuse the curves, make it hard to tell which way the thing is pointing. Same technique, opposite goal." Wu contributed his knowledge of how the human eye tracked patterns and processed visual information. His family's business had specialized in signs that were visible from long distances, and he had learned the principles of contrast, color theory, and visual hierarchy. "The eye is lazy," Wu explained, while mixing pigments to precise specifications. "It wants to find familiar patterns, familiar shapes. Give it what it expects and it processes information quickly. Disrupt those expectations and you slow down the recognition process. In sign painting, you want quick recognition. In camouflage, you want delayed recognition. Same principles, inverted application." Jameson, who admitted he couldn't paint a straight line to save his life, mixed pigments according to formulas Archer had calculated and served as a test observer, standing at various distances to judge the effect. Every hour or so, he would walk out to different distances, 50 feet, 100 feet, 200 feet, and report back on how visible the aircraft was and what aspects of its shape remained distinct. "Looking at it up close, it's pretty," Jameson said on the second night, standing back to admire their progress. "Like something you'd hang in a museum, abstract art or something. But from 200 feet? Lee, it's like the plane isn't entirely there. Parts of it just kind of blur away, especially when you're not looking directly at it. My peripheral vision just slides right off it." That was exactly what Archer wanted. The human eye was better at detecting movement in peripheral vision than detail, but it needed contrasting edges to lock onto. By disrupting those edges, the camouflage made it harder for peripheral vision to register the aircraft's presence, buying precious seconds before direct visual contact was established. By the third night, they had completed the fuselage and wings. The vertical stabilizer and horizontal stabilizers received the same treatment. Irregular patterns flowing across all surfaces. In daylight, when the base mechanic crew arrived and saw the finished product, reactions ranged from amazement to confusion. The paint job looked bizarre, swirling patterns of blue that seemed almost decorative, like something that belonged in an art gallery rather than a combat zone. But when Archer taxied out for an early morning test flight, with the sun still low and the sky that particular shade of Mediterranean azure that he had been studying for weeks, ground crew members later reported that the aircraft seemed to fade in and out of visibility depending on angle and distance. At certain angles, it was clearly visible. At others, especially when viewed against the sky rather than the ground, it seemed to blur and become indistinct. The crew chief, Master Sergeant Raymond Phillips, a gruff career military man from Alabama who had initially been skeptical of Negro pilots but had become one of the squadron's strongest supporters after watching them perform under pressure, stood watching the test flight with his arms crossed and a thoughtful expression. "Well, I'll be damned," Phillips muttered as he watched Archer's aircraft climb into the morning sky. "The crazy son of a gun actually might have something there." The real test came on September 2nd, during a bomber escort mission to Salerno in preparation for the upcoming Allied invasion. Archer's flight of 4 P-40s was tasked with top cover, flying at 24,000 feet above the main formation. Intelligence reported German Bf-109 units operating in the area, drawn from elite units that had been fighting on the Eastern Front and were being rested and re-equipped in Italy. These weren't inexperienced pilots. They were combat veterans who knew their business. The briefing officer, a major from group headquarters, had been blunt about the expected opposition. Expect contact, expect competent opposition, and expect casualties. The mission's primary objective was to get the bombers to target and back. Everything else was secondary. 20 minutes into the mission, with the bomber formation cruising at 18,000 feet and the escort fighters weaving above, Archer's radio crackled with the warning he had been anticipating. "Bogies, 4 o'clock high, 6 aircraft, approximately 8,000 yards." Archer craned his neck, scanning the bright sky. The glare was brutal at this altitude, and initially he saw nothing. Then, there, sun glinting off canopies, 6 aircraft in loose formation, definitely German from their silhouette and the way they moved. They hadn't attacked yet, which meant they were either positioning carefully or hadn't spotted the American formation. Standard German tactics would have them climbing for altitude advantage before diving to attack. Archer made his decision instantly, keying his radio transmitter. "Baker flight, this is Baker leader. Maintain heading and altitude. Let's see if they see us." It was a calculated risk. Standard doctrine called for immediately turning to face threats, gaining whatever altitude and position you could before engagement. But Archer wanted to know if his camouflage worked. He wanted data. If the Germans spotted them despite the camouflage, he would know the concept failed, and could abandon it before other pilots wasted time and resources on similar modifications. The German formation continued their approach, now clearly visible as Bf-109s, the angular shark-like silhouette unmistakable. Archer could make out individual aircraft now, could see the mottled grey-green camouflage pattern that was standard for German fighters in this theatre. They were maintaining formation, flying with the practiced precision of experienced pilots. 4,000 feet separation, 3,000, 2,000. Archer's pulse hammered, but he kept his aircraft steady, maintaining the gentle weave pattern that was standard for escort fighters. His hand stayed near the throttle, ready to shove it forward and break into them if they showed any indication they had spotted the American fighters. The German flight leader passed within 1,500 feet, close enough that Archer could see the individual panel lines on the Messerschmitt's fuselage, never wavering, never showing any indication he had spotted 4 American fighters almost directly below his position. "Baker leader, they're blind to us," Jameson's voice came through, tense with amazement and a hint of disbelief. "They're looking right through us." "Roger that. Baker flight, let's educate them. On my mark, pull up and engage. Targeting discipline. Confirm Jerry before firing. 3, 2, 1, mark." 4 P-40s pitched up simultaneously, climbing into the surprised German formation from below and behind. The engagement lasted 90 seconds, but felt both faster and slower. Time compressed and expanded the way it always did in combat. Archer got on the tail of a Bf-109, whose pilot was still looking for threats in the wrong direction, centered the illuminated gun sight pipper on the enemy's fuselage, and pressed the trigger. His .650 caliber machine guns roared, the aircraft shuddering with recoil, and he watched pieces tear away from the Germans' wing root. The Messerschmitt rolled inverted and dove away, trailing smoke and what might have been coolant. Jameson confirmed damaging another, his bullets punching holes through the enemy's tail section. The remaining 4 Germans broke formation immediately and fled east, abandoning the attack before it even began properly, clearly shocked by the ambush. No American aircraft were hit. The bomber formation continued to target unmolested, completed their strike, and returned to base without encountering further opposition. During the debriefing, Roberts listened to Archer's report with an expression that shifted from skeptical to thoughtful to impressed. The intelligence officer, Captain Morrison, looked like he had been forced to swallow something bitter. "You're telling me they flew right past you?" Roberts asked, keeping his voice neutral but unable to completely hide his interest. 6 experienced German pilots didn't spot 4 fighters at 1,500 feet separation. "The camouflage worked, sir. Against the sky, we're nearly invisible, especially to someone who isn't looking for us in that position. They were searching above and ahead, expecting us to be where doctrine says we should be. We were below them, and their eyes just slid right past us." "Or they were inexperienced pilots who missed you through incompetence," Morrison interjected, clearly uncomfortable with the implications. "Sir, with respect, one of them had at least 20 victory markings on his fuselage. I counted them before I engaged. These weren't training squadron rookies. These were combat veterans, and they flew right past us because they couldn't see us." Morrison made notes but said nothing further. Roberts studied the mission report, comparing it with previous missions' outcomes. "How many aircraft can Sergeant Briggs repaint in a week?" Roberts asked quietly. "With the current crew and working at night to avoid questions, maybe 2 aircraft per week. With more help and official approval, could probably do 6 or 8. Roberts nodded slowly. "I'll send a report up the chain, no promises, but if your results hold up over the next few missions, we might be able to expand this officially. In the meantime, continue as you have been. Carefully." Within 10 days, 6 aircraft in the 99th Fighter Squadron bore variations of Archer's camouflage scheme. The results were immediate and dramatic. The squadron's engagement success rate, measured as favorable outcomes in encounters with enemy aircraft, climbed from 42% to 78% over a 3-week period. More significantly, the rate at which they were bounced by German fighters dropped precipitously. In August, the squadron had been surprised by enemy attacks in 63% of engagements. In September, that number fell to 18%. Intelligence officers began noticing a pattern in intercepted German communications, references to ghost aircraft, and frustrated reports of American fighters that seemed to appear without warning. One decrypted message from a German squadron commander to his group headquarters complained that American tactics have changed significantly. Their aircraft appear without warning, engage aggressively and disengage before coordinated response possible. Requesting intelligence assessment of new aircraft type or technological development. The German intelligence assessment never came because they were looking for the wrong explanation. They assumed some technological advancement, some new aircraft type or electronic device. The idea that the answer was simply paint applied in innovative patterns never occurred to them because it was too simple, too low-tech, too unlike what they expected from American forces known for their industrial might and technological superiority. On September 16th, during a mission over Naples, Archer experienced the full effectiveness of his design in a way that would become one of the squadron's most told stories. He was flying top cover alone. His assigned wingman had aborted 30 minutes into the mission with mechanical issues, a persistent oil leak that threatened engine failure, when he spotted 2 Bf-109s stalking a damaged Boeing B-25 bomber limping toward Allied lines. The bomber's right engine was streaming smoke, one of its propeller blades bent and motionless, and it had dropped below the main formation, losing altitude steadily. An easy target, alone and helpless. The German pilots were setting up for what they clearly expected to be a simple victory, positioning themselves for a coordinated attack from different angles that would give the bomber's gunners no chance to defend effectively. Archer watched them maneuver, his mind calculating angles, speeds, and timing. He had 2 choices: radio for assistance and hope other fighters could reach the bomber in time or engage immediately, despite being outnumbered. The numbers didn't favor him. 2 experienced German pilots against 1 American, and both Germans would know their aircraft's capabilities intimately. But he had one advantage they didn't know about. Archer pushed his throttle forward, diving to intercept, building speed. He expected the German pilots to see him coming. A single fighter against 2 was bold to the point of recklessness, and they should have spotted his dive, should have broken formation to engage this new threat. But they remained focused on the bomber, closing in for the attack, completely unaware of his presence. He came in from their 7 o'clock position, slightly low, the sun behind him, and his camouflaged aircraft blending into the azure sky. At 400 yards, he opened fire on the trailing Messerschmitt, walking his tracers into the fuselage, seeing his bullets punch through the thin aluminum skin. The German aircraft shuddered, rolled violently right, and began streaming what looked like coolant from its engine, the worst possible damage in combat, as loss of coolant meant engine overheat and seizure within minutes. Only then did the German flight leader react, braking hard left and climbing, searching for this phantom attacker that had appeared from nowhere. But Archer had already reversed, using his aircraft's superior low-altitude maneuverability to position for another pass. The P-40 couldn't climb with the Messerschmitt, couldn't outrun it at high altitude, but down low where the air was thick, it could turn inside the German fighter. The German leader made his choice quickly: break off and try to save his damaged wingman, or continue attacking the bomber and hope to get the kill before this mysterious American fighter interfered further. He chose survival, breaking away and heading east, waggling his wings in the signal for his wingman to follow. Archer escorted the damaged B-25 for 30 miles until it was safely over Allied territory, and other fighters arrived to take over escort duties. As he turned back toward base, he watched the bomber crew waggle their wings in thanks, a gesture of gratitude that needed no radio communication to understand. That evening, a case of liberated Italian wine appeared at the 99th's mess tent, delivered by truck from the bomber base. Attached was a note written in careful handwriting: "To the Phantom who saved our lives, we never saw you coming, neither did Jerry. With gratitude, the crew of Lucky Strike. May we all make it home." The story spread through unofficial channels, the way all good stories spread in military units, pilots talking to pilots over drinks, squadron to squadron, base to base. Soon there were requests from other units for information about this new camouflage technique. How was it applied? What were the specifications? Could their maintenance crews replicate it? By October, several other fighter squadrons operating in the Mediterranean theater were experimenting with similar schemes, each adapting Archer's basic principles to their own operational requirements. Some used slightly different color combinations, some applied the patterns differently. But the core principle, disruptive camouflage designed for air-to-air combat rather than ground concealment, remained consistent. The Army Air Force's Material Command, the technical organization responsible for aircraft and equipment development, sent a technical officer to investigate. Captain Richard Voss arrived with measuring instruments, color charts, photographic equipment, and the deep skepticism of a man whose career was built on systematic testing and controlled conditions. He had a PhD in optical engineering from MIT and clearly viewed this field modification with suspicion. "I've reviewed your success reports," Voss said, examining Archer's aircraft in the harsh Mediterranean sunlight, using a light meter to take measurements. "Statistically improbable improvement in engagement outcomes following cosmetic modifications. Makes me think there are other variables at play. Correlation is not causation, Captain." "Such as?" Archer kept his voice neutral, knowing that Voss's real skepticism might have nothing to do with paint or statistics. "Improved tactics, better intelligence about German operations. Weaker German opposition as their best pilots are transferred to defend the homeland. Random variation in combat outcomes. The camouflage might be coincidental rather than causal. Then explain why our interception success rate tripled. Explain the German radio intercepts mentioning phantom aircraft. Explain why the rate at which we're bounced dropped 60%. Voss circled the P-40, taking photographs from multiple angles, making notes on a clipboard. I'll need to take these observations back for analysis, color spectroscopy, visual perception testing under controlled conditions. We'll need to quantify the visibility reduction, if any, and determine whether it's operationally significant. If this is legitimate, it has implications for the entire Air Force. And if it's not legitimate? Voss met Archer's eyes directly. Then I write a report saying that anecdotal combat reports do not constitute proof, that the improvements are likely due to other factors, and that unauthorized aircraft modifications should be discouraged. Either way, I'm going to find out the truth. 3 weeks later, Voss returned with a team of specialists and a directive from Army Air Force's headquarters. Conduct controlled trials comparing standard camouflage against Archer's design. The trials would be scientific, methodical, and comprehensive. They would settle the question definitively. The trials ran for 5 days, using pilots from multiple squadrons, as both test subjects flying the aircraft and observers trying to spot them. Aircraft were painted in different schemes, some in standard camouflage, some in variations of Archer's design, and observed from various altitudes, angles, and lighting conditions. The observers didn't know which aircraft were which until after they recorded their observations. Preventing bias. The results were quantified, measured, cross-checked, and analyzed by multiple researchers. The conclusion was unambiguous and, for some, uncomfortable. Archer's multi-tone blue camouflage reduced visual detection range by an average of 38% compared to standard earth tone schemes when aircraft were viewed against sky backgrounds. The reduction varied based on specific conditions, time of day, altitude, angle of observation, but under all conditions tested, the adaptive camouflage performed significantly better than standard schemes for air-to-air combat scenarios. In practical terms, this meant an enemy pilot would need to be approximately 1/3 closer to spot a camouflaged aircraft, a difference of potentially 1,500 to 2,000 feet in typical combat scenarios. In aerial combat, where engagements often began with one side spotting the other first, and using that advantage to dictate the terms of combat, 1,500 feet of detection advantage was enormous. "Congratulations, Captain," Voss said during the results briefing, his scientific skepticism replaced by professional respect. "You've just rewritten tactical camouflage doctrine. Headquarters wants this standardized across Mediterranean operations. I'm authorized to begin developing production specifications and distribution protocols." But Archer shook his head firmly. "It shouldn't be standardized, that's the point. That's exactly the wrong lesson to take from this." Voss looked confused. "We've proven it works. Why wouldn't we want every aircraft to benefit? Because the Germans will adapt if they see the same pattern repeatedly. What should be standardized is the principle: adaptive camouflage based on operational environment. Every squadron should develop variations specific to where they're fighting. North Sea operations need different camouflage than Mediterranean operations. High-altitude bomber escort needs different schemes than low-altitude ground attack. The enemy should never be able to predict what they're going to see." This was revolutionary thinking. Military doctrine valued uniformity, standardization, identical approaches applied universally. Logistics favored standardization. Command and control favored standardization. The entire military-industrial complex was built on the idea that one solution, properly designed, could be applied everywhere with consistent results. Archer was proposing the opposite, encouraging innovation, adaptation, regional variation. He was suggesting that the military should embrace diversity of approach, that different units should be empowered to develop their own solutions adapted to their specific operational requirements. Voss looked profoundly uncomfortable with the idea. "That's not how the military works, Captain. We need consistency, reproducible results, centralized control. What you're proposing is chaos." "With respect, sir, that's exactly what got us flying dark aircraft against light skies in the first place. European camouflage applied universally, regardless of whether it made sense for the specific theater. The Germans have been adapting their camouflage for years, different patterns for different regions, and we're finally catching up. You want to freeze us in place again by standardizing a single pattern?" The debate continued through command channels for weeks, generating memos, reports, and increasingly heated discussions. Conservative officers argued for standardization. Progressive officers argued for adaptive doctrine. Combat veterans weighed in with operational perspectives. Logisticians worried about maintenance and supply chain complications. In the end, a compromise emerged, as military compromises often do. Standardized guidelines for adaptive camouflage, with authorized variations based on theater of operations and mission profiles. Archer's Mediterranean Blue scheme became one of several approved patterns, along with schemes for European operations, North Sea operations and Pacific operations. The principle of mission-specific camouflage was incorporated into training doctrine, and squadron commanders were given authority to approve variations based on operational requirements. It wasn't everything Archer had argued for, but it was movement in the right direction. It was acknowledgement that one size didn't fit all, that local innovation had value, that the people closest to the problem often saw solutions that distant experts missed. By December 1943, Archer had flown 68 combat missions and was credited with 4 confirmed aerial victories and 5 probable, numbers that would have been unremarkable for any other pilot, but carried additional weight given that every success by the Tuskegee Airmen was weaponized in ongoing debates about military integration and the capabilities of Negro pilots. But the true impact of his innovation became apparent in ways that couldn't be counted in victory tallies or mission reports. Pilots who flew aircraft using adaptive camouflage reported increased confidence. They felt less vulnerable, more in control of engagement terms, more like hunters than prey. This psychological advantage translated into more aggressive tactics, better decision-making in combat, and ultimately higher survival rates. The data supported their subjective experience. Squadrons using adaptive camouflage showed lower casualty rates, higher mission success rates, and better pilot retention than squadrons using standard camouflage. The differences weren't enormous. Military outcomes are influenced by hundreds of variables, but they were statistically significant and operationally meaningful. On January 8, 1944, Archer participated in an escort mission for Boeing B-17 bombers, striking aircraft factories near Vienna, deep in German-controlled territory. The mission profile was brutal. 7 hours flying time, 600 miles penetration into hostile airspace, against some of the most experienced and best-equipped fighter units in the world. Intelligence predicted heavy opposition. Archer led a flight of 8 P-47s. The squadron had transitioned to the newer, longer-ranged fighter in late December, all painted in variations of the adaptive camouflage. The bomber formation they were escorting numbered 48 aircraft, a massive formation by European standards, and the contrails began forming as they climbed through 18,000 feet over the Alps, white streamers marking their passage across the crystalline winter sky. The German fighters came in waves, as intelligence had predicted. First, the Bf-109s, making high-speed slashing attacks from above, trying to break up the bomber formation. Then the Focke-Wulf FW-190s, heavily armed and armored, concentrating on bombers that had been damaged in the first wave. The air filled with tracers, smoke, falling aircraft, and the desperate radio chatter of units under attack. Archer's camouflage gave him a critical advantage. He could position his flight without being spotted until the moment of engagement. While German fighters focused on the obvious threats, the P-47s with standard paint jobs, Archer's flight maneuvered into attack positions almost unopposed. They would appear behind German formations, attack aggressively, and disengage before coordinated response was possible. In the swirling combat over Austria, Archer destroyed 2 Bf-109s and damaged a third. His flight downed 5 enemy aircraft without loss, and crucially, the bombers they were protecting made it to target and back with acceptable losses. 12 aircraft failed to return, which was tragic but within expected parameters for such a deep penetration mission. After landing, exhausted and dehydrated after 7 hours in the cockpit, breathing oxygen through a mask, muscles cramped from tension and cold, Archer found Major Roberts waiting with unusual news. "You've been requested for temporary duty at Wright Field," Roberts said, handing over the official orders. "They want you to consult on camouflage development for the next generation of aircraft. Jet propulsion, apparently. It's all classified, but they specifically asked for you by name. I'm a combat pilot, sir, not an engineer. You're the combat pilot who changed how we think about tactical camouflage. Take the assignment, Lee. The conflict isn't just won in the air. It's won by the people smart enough to give our pilots every possible advantage. Sometimes that means flying missions, and sometimes that means making sure the next generation has better tools than we did. Archer spent 6 weeks at Wright Field in Ohio, the Army Air Force's main research and development facility, working with engineers developing the Republic P-84 and Lockheed P-80 jet fighters. These aircraft would fly at speeds approaching 600 miles per hour and altitudes exceeding 40,000 feet, performance parameters that made existing camouflage theories obsolete. At those speeds and altitudes, visual detection worked differently, and Archer's insights into human perception under combat stress proved invaluable. He proposed counterintuitive ideas based on his combat experience. At extreme altitudes, make aircraft darker on the bottom rather than lighter, because they would be spotted against the ground, not the sky. Use sharp contrast patterns that would make range estimation difficult at high closing speeds. When fighters were approaching each other at combined speeds exceeding 1,000 miles per hour, disrupting range perception could prevent accurate deflection shooting. Consider the psychological impact of unexpected colors. Paint wing tips bright red to draw attention away from the fuselage during split-second engagements, exploiting the human tendency to focus on the most visually striking element. Not all his ideas were implemented. Some were deemed too radical, others failed testing under controlled conditions. But the fundamental principle he advocated, that camouflage should be an active tactical tool designed around human perception and combat psychology, not passive concealment based on making aircraft hard to see under static conditions, became embedded in design philosophy. The jet fighters that would dominate the skies over Korea and later Vietnam bore the intellectual fingerprints of insights first tested over the Mediterranean by a pilot who mixed paint in a tent and proved that tactical advantage could come from unexpected sources. Archer returned to combat operations in March 1944, now flying with the 332nd Fighter Group. An all-black unit that had been formed after the success of the 99th proved impossible for even the most resistant commanders to ignore or dismiss. He flew the new North American P-51 Mustang, arguably the finest fighter aircraft of the entire conflict, with its long range that allowed escort deep into German territory, high speed that matched or exceeded anything the Germans could field, and excellent maneuverability that made it deadly in dogfights. His combat career continued until the European conflict ended in May 1945, accumulating over 169 missions and 9 confirmed aerial victories, plus 16 probable and damaged claims. But statistics don't capture the fuller story of his contribution. The lives saved and missions succeeded because of innovations that began with paint and evolved into doctrine. Dozens of pilots who flew with adaptive camouflage survived encounters they might otherwise have lost, returning home to families who never knew how close death had come. Bomber crews made it home because their escorts could position effectively without being spotted, protecting them from attacks that never materialized because the attackers were themselves attacked first. The German Air Force, already struggling with fuel shortages, pilot losses, and overwhelming numerical inferiority, faced an additional challenge. American fighters that seemed to materialize from empty sky, that couldn't be predicted or anticipated, using conventional tactical assumptions. After the conflict ended, Archer remained in the military through the painful process of integration and the gradual dismantling of segregated units. He flew in Korea, commanding fighter squadrons and contributing to tactical development for jet operations. He retired as a lieutenant colonel in 1970 after a military career that spanned 3 decades and saw him contribute to tactics, training, and doctrine development. But he rarely spoke publicly about the camouflage innovation, considering it a minor technical adjustment rather than the significant tactical advancement it represented. When asked about his military service, he preferred to talk about the men he had served with, the sacrifices they had made, and the importance of creating opportunities for the next generation. The full story emerged decades later, When military historians researching Tuskegee Airmen contributions uncovered the correspondence between Archer and Material Command, the trial reports showing the quantified effectiveness of his designs and, perhaps most tellingly, the German intelligence documents that referenced phantom American aircraft. In one intercepted report from a German squadron commander, dated November 1943, preserved in captured military archives and later translated by American intelligence, the frustrated officer wrote, "American fighter tactics have changed significantly in recent months. Their aircraft appear without warning, engage with considerable aggression, and disengage before coordinated response possible. Suspect new aircraft type or significantly improved pilot training. Request immediate intelligence assessment to determine nature of this development." The assessment never came because German intelligence was looking for technological explanations. New engines, new aircraft designs, advanced radar systems that didn't actually exist yet. They never considered that the answer was as simple and profound as paint applied in innovative patterns by a pilot who understood that survival in combat came not just from courage and skill, but from thinking differently than the enemy expected. In 1998, at a reunion of Tuskegee Airmen held in Dayton, Ohio, an elderly Lee Archer stood before a restored P-51 Mustang painted in his camouflage scheme, preserved as a museum piece representing innovation in tactical aviation. A young Air Force officer, an African-American woman flying F-15 Eagles, approached him with obvious nervousness and respect. "Colonel Archer, sir, I wanted to thank you personally. I read your tactical papers during training at the Academy. The principle of adaptive advantage, that we should constantly evolve our tactics based on environment and opposition rather than relying on standardized approaches, that's still taught today in tactical development courses." Archer studied the young officer, seeing in her confident bearing and professional pride the future he and his fellow Tuskegee Airmen had fought to make possible. A future where capability mattered more than color, where excellence was recognized regardless of its source. "The paint was never the real innovation," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of decades of reflection. "It was refusing to accept that the way things were was the way things had to be. They told us we couldn't fly fighters, so we did anyway. They gave us inadequate equipment and expected us to fail, so we improvised and succeeded. They set standards impossibly high and hoped we would break, so we exceeded those standards. The camouflage was just paint. The real innovation was insisting on excellence, even when excellence wasn't expected or wanted from us." The young officer nodded seriously. "Sir, that's still the lesson. Every day I fly, I'm proving something, not to anyone else anymore, but to myself, that I belong in that cockpit, that I can execute the mission. That innovation and excellence aren't about where you come from, but where you're determined to go." Archer smiled, genuine warmth in his weathered face. "Then the lesson survived, and that's all any of us could hope for. We broke barriers so that you wouldn't have to. We proved capability so that you wouldn't have to constantly reprove it. Your battles are different, but the principle remains. Never accept limitations that don't make sense. Never stop looking for better ways, and never let anyone tell you that you can't do something that you know you can." The technical specifications of Archer's camouflage, the specific paint formulations, the pattern algorithms, the photometric measurements proving effectiveness, these were preserved in military archives and influenced post-conflict development in ways both direct and indirect. But the deeper innovation, the one that mattered most in the long term, was the proof that tactical advantage could come from unexpected sources, that the pilot facing discrimination and doubt could contribute insights that eluded established experts with advanced degrees and institutional authority, and that necessity combined with creativity could yield solutions that changed how an entire military force approached fundamental problems. In the decades after the conflict ended, as the Air Force fully integrated, and the achievements of the Tuskegee Airmen became recognized as essential to air combat history rather than footnotes or curiosities, Archer's camouflage story became emblematic of a larger truth. That diversity of perspective isn't just morally right, but tactically advantageous. The pilot who saw problems differently because his experience was different, because his path to the cockpit had been different, could identify solutions that homogeneous thinking missed entirely. Modern military aircraft still use adaptive camouflage, though now assisted by computer modeling and advanced materials science. Stealth technology has made visual camouflage less critical for some missions, but the principle remains embedded in tactical thinking. Control the terms of engagement by making yourself difficult to detect until the moment you choose to engage. That principle, first proven effective by a Tuskegee airman mixing paint in a Mediterranean tent while the official experts said it couldn't work, continues to save lives and win engagements. Lee Archer passed away in January 2010 at the age of 90, having lived to see an African-American president commanding the military he had served, an integrated armed forces where his granddaughter could aspire to any rank or position based solely on merit, and a world fundamentally different from the one he had navigated as a young pilot facing discrimination from his own command structure and enemies in the sky. His obituary in military journals and major newspapers mentioned his aerial victories, his command positions, his post-military career in corporate aviation, where he had served as vice president of a major aerospace company. Some mentioned the camouflage innovation, though usually as a footnote to his combat record, an interesting detail in a life full of achievement. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from an unexpected source. In 2012, the German Luftwaffe Historical Society, an organization of historians and veterans dedicated to preserving accurate military history, published a research paper examining tactical innovations during the Mediterranean campaign of 1943 to 45. The paper's conclusion acknowledged that American air superiority in the Mediterranean resulted not just from numerical advantage, though American industrial production certainly provided overwhelming numbers, but from continuous tactical evolution, including camouflage innovations that disrupted established visual acquisition doctrine and forced adaptation of defensive tactics. The paper's author, a retired German Air Force officer with a PhD in military history, included testimony from surviving pilots who had flown against American forces in 1943 and 44. One account, from a pilot who had survived the conflict to become a flight instructor and had trained the post-war German Air Force, stood out for its specific detail. "We were trained extensively in aircraft recognition and visual acquisition," the testimony read in translation. "We knew Allied aircraft types by silhouette, by movement patterns, by the way light reflected from metal surfaces at different angles and altitudes. Our training was comprehensive and continuous, but sometime in late 1943, American fighters began appearing in the Mediterranean theater that violated these established recognition patterns. They seemed to blur into the sky, to appear only when they chose to attack, rather than being visible at expected ranges. We called them Geisterflugzeuge, ghost aircraft. The term spread through pilot briefings and became common reference. I was fortunate to survive 3 encounters with these phantom aircraft. Many of my comrades and friends were not so fortunate. We never understood the mechanism behind this phenomenon during the conflict itself." The German officer didn't know he was describing the work of one innovative pilot who refused to accept inadequate equipment, who applied artistic understanding to tactical problems, who proved that excellence could emerge from unexpected sources and unconventional thinking. But his testimony, preserved in military archives on both sides of the Atlantic, cross-referenced with American after-action reports and technical assessments, stands as verification of what Archer achieved: a measurable, significant advantage in combat through nothing more complicated than paint applied with intelligence, insight, and systematic testing. The story of how a black pilot painted his plane so smart the German Air Force couldn't see it coming is, at its deepest level, a story about innovation under pressure, about refusing to accept limitations that don't make sense, about how individual creativity can shift outcomes even in conflicts decided by industrial production and mass armies numbering in the millions. It's about seeing problems from angles that orthodox thinking missed, and having the courage to implement solutions even when doing so meant violating norms and risking censure from authorities. In an age of stealth fighters invisible to radar, of drone aircraft piloted from continents away, of air combat increasingly mediated by computers and missiles fired from beyond visual range, there's something almost quaint about a pilot mixing paint to gain tactical advantage, But the principle, that human insight and creativity, remain essential even in technological warfare. That innovation can come from anywhere if we're willing to recognize it, that the person facing the problem often sees solutions that distant experts miss. This principle remains as relevant as ever. Lee Archer's camouflage didn't end the conflict. It didn't shift strategic balance between nations or change the ultimate trajectory of campaigns. But it saved lives, demonstrably and measurably. It proved that adaptive thinking could counter established doctrine, and it demonstrated that excellence knows no boundaries of race or background, that capability exists wherever individuals are given opportunity and refuse to accept artificial limitations. For the pilots who flew with his innovations, for the bomber crews who made it home, because their escorts could position effectively without being spotted prematurely, for the commanders who learned to encourage rather than suppress innovation from unexpected sources, for the military that eventually understood that diversity of perspective was tactical advantage rather than administrative inconvenience. Archer's contribution was anything but footnote material. It was the difference between success and failure, between surviving combat and not, between proving doubters wrong and confirming their prejudices. And in the end, that's precisely what makes his story worth preserving and retelling. Not just the technical achievement, impressive though it was, but what it represented about human potential, about the power of individual insight to matter. Even in the vast machinery of industrial warfare involving millions of participants, and about the critical importance of creating systems that allow innovation to emerge from anyone, anywhere, regardless of whether they fit the expected profile of innovator or genius. The ghost aircraft that haunted German pilots over Italy and Austria were real. They were painted by hand in a North African tent by a pilot who refused to accept that the way things were was the way things had to be. They were tested in combat, refined through experience, validated through systematic trials, and proven effective beyond any reasonable doubt. And they stand as testament to the idea that in any human endeavor, whether military or civilian, organizational or individual, the next breakthrough might come from the person you least expect, from the perspective you haven't considered, from the individual who sees the problem differently because their path to that problem was different. If you're wise enough to listen, humble enough to recognize that expertise can come from unexpected sources, and brave enough to implement good ideas, regardless of their origin, you create the conditions for innovation that can change outcomes, save lives, and prove that excellence recognizes no boundaries except those we artificially impose. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.